Hi everyone, and welcome to Core Lecture 13. Today we'll discuss exploring different source types. Before we begin, you'll need the following materials for today's lecture assignment. You'll need access to your Week 7 homework document, you'll need access to the internet, and access to your Project 2 materials. The purpose and goals for today's lecture are as follows. We'll define and distinguish between the terms scholarly and popular sources. We'll examine the rhetorical considerations of sources and the different source types. And we'll discuss the diverse modes and media sources can take. So I just mentioned the terms scholarly and popular sources with sort of an emphasis on both of those terms. I do that because in academic writing, sources are often broken down into one of two categories. They are either considered scholarly sources or popular sources. Now, for Project 2, you are more than likely using a mixture of both scholarly and popular. However, you'll need to develop a critical awareness of what these two types of sources look like and when they will be appropriate. Especially for projects 3 and 4, we will be moving into dealing with almost exclusively scholarly sources. So it's important as you're going through and you're collecting research, you're collecting content that you can use to support your own argument, that you are drawing from more scholarly sources than popular. So let's take a look in more detail about what those two terms mean and how we can best identify them, and also looking at their rhetorical appropriateness in a given text. To get us started on this examination of these two terms, let's first look at scholarly sources. Let's define scholarly sources. So when we think about scholarly sources, these are going to be publications, whether books or periodicals, that contribute to a body of academic knowledge on a given topic. These works are often grounded in a discipline's theory and or reproducible experiments to further a topic's conversation, and they're works that function as a form of inquiry rather than reporting. And that can be a really crucial way to determine, okay, is this a popular source or a scholarly source? Because remember, when we get into Project 3 and as well as into Project 4, we're almost going to be exclusively dealing with scholarly works here. So you want to make sure that, again, you are identifying these properly. So some examples of scholarly sources could be the Journal of Economic Perspectives, the Journal of Psychology, the Journal of Popular Culture, Journal of Cellular Biotechnology. I believe this last one, Jay said, is the Journal of Special Education Technology. And so you can see how a lot of these works are very much grounded in academic interest. To say, okay, well, we want to know more about psychology. We want to know more about popular culture. We want to know more about cellular biotechnology. So each one of these journals, among others, that you will likely find almost exclusively in the library's scholarly databases, they're really grounded in saying, okay, we're all really interested in this particular topic. Now let's conduct experiments or do studies or really dig into the theoretical underpinnings of a certain topic, and let's publish it to further a particular conversation. So now that we've defined what a scholarly source is and gotten a sense of what it looks like, let's talk about ways that we can more confidently determine if we are looking at a scholarly source as opposed to, in this case, a popular source. So first and foremost, scholarly sources are usually found in special databases. So open more to the public, these are going to be things like Google Scholar, for instance. Google Scholar is a good example of how you, even if you're not associated with a particular university, you still can access academic journals. The issue with Google Scholar, though, is, at least as an example, is that oftentimes you get stuck behind a paywall. That is when you as a student have the opportunity to turn to the library databases that DSU provides. And a lot of the times you will find these scholarly sources in those databases. I do want to say, though, that just because you find a particular article in or a particular work in one of these library databases doesn't necessarily guarantee that it is a scholarly source. It's a good indication that it might be, and you are certainly in the right place. But as we start to further determine what a scholarly source is, you might find yourself saying, okay, yes, this report from AP may seem very credible, but it ultimately is a popular source, even though I found it in Nexus Uni, for example, which is an academic database. Scholarly sources are oftentimes very specific in content. Most journals, especially, will have special issues where they focus on certain topics. So, for example, if we go back and let's take a couple of these journals here, for example, let's say we are looking at the Journal of Popular Culture. Well, maybe the Journal of Popular Culture wants to do a special issue on adult animation shows and how we can apply Marxist theory to it. So that seems really super specific, but you will get a number of scholars who will say, hey, yeah, I'm working on a piece looking at The Simpsons or looking at Rick and Morty through a Marxist lens. And so they're going to be very specific oftentimes in nature. And even the individual articles or publications that you find will speak more to something very niche specific as opposed to something more broad, like you might see in a more popular journal or in a more popular source. To sort of show that difference, for example, in the Journal of Economic Perspectives, perhaps you find an article that just talks about, let's say, ranching in southern Utah and the implications of local economics on that particular part of the economy, right? So that is something that you would probably find in the Journal of Economic Perspectives. However, as we'll discuss here in just a few minutes, you might find something broader in a popular journal to say, oh, here's what ranching or farming in the West looks like. And here are the economic implications of that. And we'll look at Southern Utah for a case example, or just as a couple sentences here or there to fulfill our reporting duties. Whereas the Journal of Economic Perspectives is really going to dig into that topic and really explore its consequences and implications. So what can we do with the content they discover? Also with scholarly sources, and this is for better or worse, it can make it easier to identify as a scholarly source, but once you've identified that and try to engage with the content, this is where it becomes a little problematic, is that they use jargon or terms that would be familiar to those in the field. Because these are often experts writing for other individuals who express an interest in this topic, they don't define a lot of things. They'll just assume to say, oh, you know what I'm talking about. You know how to use this term. You know how this term is applied in discussions regarding whatever topic it is I happen to be exploring. So if you see a work that's found in a database that has in a library database that has very specific content and uses quite a bit of jargon or isn't gracious with their definitions, these can all be indicators that you have a scholarly source. The arguments that are presented or the areas that the authors are really looking into typically tend to fill gaps left by other scholars. Let's say, again, go back to our example on with the journal, I believe it's the Journal of Cellular Biology, Cellular Biotechnology. Okay, I'm going to be honest, this is not my wheelhouse, so I'm just going to make up an example here to say, okay, well, let's say that someone looked at a particular topic, but did so a few years back. And now a new researcher says, okay, this person studied this particular, cell or cell, architecture, but they did so with data technology. So I'd like to look at what they did, but do so in a way that uses the technology that we have available today. So remember, that's not all that uncommon, especially in STEM related fields. And it really is just an act of synthesis to a degree, because it's someone saying, okay, well, there were some shortcomings or there were some things that could be improved from prior research. Now I'm going to fill those holes. I'm going to make those improvements. I'm going to answer those unanswered questions. So scholarly sources, that's really the name of the game a lot of the time, is to say, okay, so-and-so didn't cover this. I'm curious how they might. So I'm going to step it up and I'm going to answer this question or attempt to do so. Circling back to our question, or our, not necessarily question, but emphasis on ethos. Scholarly sources are oftentimes or almost exclusively written by experts in the field. And what that means is typically you will get someone with a lot of letters either after or before their name, because they, be it PhD, MD, MBA, JD, whatever the case may be, however they may be an expert in their field, these are people who know what they're talking about. These are people who have conducted and designed the experiments. These are individuals who have deeply immersed themselves in the important theories of the field or discipline for years. These are people who are just super knowledgeable on the topic. And so again, oftentimes scholarly sources are going to be written either by individuals at private think tanks, or they are going to be written by individuals who work at universities, colleges, or other types of formal research institutions. So they're not going to be, just reporters that you might see on the news, or those who, might just have a floating interest in something. So another thing with scholarly sources is that they often undergo months and sometimes even years of revision. As you go through the library databases, you'll probably see in almost every database, I believe, that we have available to us through the DSU library, there is an option to say peer reviewed. If you see that as a way to filter your results, use and account for that peer review filter feature. What peer review means and how it helps you recognize something as scholarly versus popular is it's not just that these works are written by experts in the field, but they are carefully reviewed and scrutinized by other experts in the field. So even though you may have someone who is just the tops at rural economics in the Southwest, writing on, the economics of ranchers in southern Utah, while you may have someone who is an expert in that field, they send out their work to other experts in the field to ensure that their experiments, that they can reproduce them and yield similar results, to ensure that the theories that are being presented to the readers are accurately represented and accurately articulated and utilized. So it's not just that these works are written by experts in the field, it's that they are heavily, again, scrutinized is really the best word, and critiqued by other experts in the field, which really allows us to say, yes, this is the best possible research on this topic that could exist in this moment. Because of that, the results are verifiable and credible. Like I said, when these works go through the peer review process, it's not just, someone else at another university or another think tank saying, okay, it's good, there's no comma splices. No, they go through with a fine-tooth comb and say, all right, so-and-so says this about this particular theorist, but they're not accounting for the most recent research that they've done. I think it's in our reader's best benefit for the writer to account for this in order for them to fully understand the theory being used. Or, someone could say, okay, well, I tried to reproduce this experiment and I ran into these issues with the methodology. Either the author needs to clarify, where I went wrong, or they need to reassess their own methods for this particular experiment. But because of that, again, the results are verifiable and credible. And oftentimes, you're not seeing a lot of this backtracking. There aren't a lot of corrections. So I'll get to this more in a minute. But, if you have ever watched any kind of, nightly news or, read any kind of daily news, you're more likely to see, statements to say, this article has been updated to account for this information we didn't know at the time. Academic journals, academic works, it's very unlikely that you see that because again, these experiments, inquiries, they really do, undergo months and if not years of thought and revision. So there isn't a lot to go back on with these. Also with scholarly sources is that they include extensive references or works cited pages. So much like I'm going to ask you to include a references or a works cited page or a bibliography at the end of your project 4, you will also see this with the scholarly works that you're engaging with. And I would definitely recommend if you are going through an article and you say, hey, this source that they're citing is really fascinating, go to their works cited, go to their references or their bibliography page and say, okay, well, how could I find this article? How can I find this book? How can I find this scholarly web text? And perhaps use it in my own work. I'll switch gears to looking at what popular sources are. So to ground popular sources, especially in 2019, they're commonly associated with mass media and mass media outlets. So when we use the term popular sources, you would be correct if something like the examples I have here, so like The Economist, Times, CNN, Fox News, if one of those or a similar type of outlet popped into your mind. These are publications or published works designed to inform rather than function as a form of scholarly inquiry. So they're typically often developed to be consumed and understood by a wider audience, a more diverse audience that may not have a working expertise on a particular topic. So the content, because of that, is typically not grounded in theory or reproducible experiments. So with that, again, a lot of what this comes down to is that they're reporting perhaps on what others have done and what others have discovered, but they themselves are not doing the experimentation. They themselves are not doing the sort of theoretical groundwork that we would see in a scholarly source. Now let's talk about what we can look at to most effectively determine if we're looking at a popular source. So with popular sources, they are far more accessible. They really are. And interestingly enough, and I'll get off this soapbox here in a minute, there has been some talk, within those in the community who are publishing scholarly works to say, why do people have to pay so much for our works? Why can't we just make it more publicly accessible like you would a Wikipedia page or a CNN article or a clip from Fox News, things of that sort. So open access is becoming a thing with scholarly works, just so you know, but it has not been fully realized quite yet. But popular sources, because of their accessibility, so you can find it like by using Google or Bing or even downloading websites that are specifically geared towards providing you with these popular sources. The content tends to be more broad. So think about, for example, an article, let's say, on global warming or climate change or whatever the case may be. So if you were to find an article about that, let's say in the Wall Street Journal or The Economist or something like that, again, a more popular, a popular source, it is going to be broader in nature, where it is going to say, okay, well, largely these are the impacts of climate change. This is how it's going to hit us, on a global level, or these are the people who are going to be displaced by it, or whatever the case may be. However, so that's going to be broad in terms of, how they're thinking about the topic, how they're discussing it. Whereas with scholarly articles or scholarly works, they're going to say, okay, we're going to talk about climate change, but we're just going to talk about how climate change is going to impact the southern Utah area based off of the water reserves that are in, let's say, Lake Powell. And so we can see how popular sources are far more broad in nature, whereas scholarly sources, again, are really specific or tend to be super specific in what they look at and how they look at it. Because popular sources are accessible and pride themselves on being accessible to larger audiences, their language is also accessible. So with scholarly articles or scholarly works, like I said, you're probably going to hit a lot of jargon, but that's because these are researchers, these are writers who are saying, okay, I'm writing for other people like me who are very who have immersed themselves in this scholarship, who have dedicated a lot of time and energy to understanding this topic in this capacity. But of course, with popular sources, not everyone is going to, know all of the scientific terms that are associated with climate change, right? And so you will not see a lot of jargon in popular sources. And if they do use jargon, they're very good to define, okay, to say, this is what this term means, this is who we're getting it from, and we're going, and they'll usually remind you throughout, especially if it's a longer article or a longer video or a longer work, they'll remind you a few times to say, oh, by the way, this is what this term means if you're not terribly familiar with it. So when I said that, with scholarly works, these are written by experts in the field. And oftentimes these individuals are employed either at a university or a college or at a political or educational think tank. Popular sources, on the other hand, are written by staffed or freelance writers who often consult experts in the field, but they themselves are not experts. So if we go back, way back to week 1, when we talked about ethos, right? So remember the example of the pastor or, the pastor and the teenager, right? Both giving a talk to the congregation. So you could see it in this case as a scholarly source, being written by the pastor. So he is the expert in the field, right? Popular sources, however, would be written by the equivalent of the teenager at the church, right? So this is someone who perhaps has a good feel of the content, but the teenager consults the pastor. The teenager, if they have questions, says, hey, am I communicating this information correctly? And much of the time, so do these staffed or freelance writers. So they themselves are not experts, but they consult experts in the field. Popular sources have a really quick publication and circulation rate. They're also, because of that, subject to future revisions. Like I said, scholarly articles, scholarly works, it is highly unlikely that you will see any kind of retraction to say, hey, we had this content wrong, or we've updated this story to reflect this. You're not going to see that in a scholarly article. However, with the fast-moving nature of news today, and with how these popular sources are reporting on it, you're going to have a really quick turnaround rate. And so you're going to get new stories every single day. But by doing that, you're not going to have the opportunity to really perform those close edits to say, okay, well, is this information correct, or is it correct enough? And if need be, we can go back and address that at a later time. Popular sources also typically includes several narratives or direct quotes. Even though narratives have become a really, they've piqued the interest of a lot of academic writers throughout many fields. They're still not terribly commonplace in scholarly writing. They're becoming commonplace, but they're still getting there. But popular sources tend to rely heavily on narratives, or they will quote the experts rather than relying on their own expertise. So rather than saying, okay, here's, some technical information about climate change, in this particular part of the country, rather than saying, okay, here's my own expertise, here's, what I've noticed, and here are my thoughts on that. They'll say, according to so and so, an expert in climate change in this particular area. And so they really rely heavily on those direct quotes as opposed to their own expertise. Because remember, many times these works aren't written by experts in the field. They might be written by people who are knowledgeable on the topic, but again, are not considered experts. And as such, they'll have a number of narratives and direct quotes, things that you're not going to see a lot of with scholarly sources. All right, let's talk lecture assignment. So, based on the topic that you want to explore for Project 2, I would like you to find one scholarly and one popular source. Now, you can do this based off of the works that you all are already citing for Project 2, or if you'd like to take this as an opportunity to explore more, you certainly can. What I'd like you to do then is compose a brief write-up, so no more than 50 words each, so 100 words total, justifying why you have categorized both sources the way you have. So let's say you're writing on climate change, right? So you could say, okay, well, I found this article from the Journal of Cellular Biotechnology. And you could say, well, it's a scholarly source because first, I found it in the library databases. Second, it's written by so-and-so, who, when I looked them up, is a professor at Harvard, and they've done a ton of research in this, so we can consider them an expert. It's got an extensive works cited page. You can tell that it's not to report anything. So basically, I want to know, how do you come to identify one as scholarly and one as popular? Then what I want you to do is compose a brief write-up, no more than 100 words total, discussing the differences and similarities in content between both sources. So to put another way, what information was common between the two and what information was unique to both? So after you, through 50 words each, have justified why you see one is scholarly and one is popular, I want you to think about, what is the difference in the content that I'm seeing? So perhaps in the scholarly article, you say, okay, well, I got a better understanding of what that methodology looked like. But maybe in the popular source, you say, okay, well, I have a better idea of how this is impacting us in real time. With the scholarly source, yeah, I know a ton with the methodology and I know more about the theories that guide the field, but took over a year to publish and is just starting to circulate when their research was grounded in, let's say, 2017. I would like to know how this applies in 2019. So that might be an example of something that you could discuss if that's something that you notice. All right, weekly homework. So include your core lecture 13 summary and assignment in your week 7 homework submission. Your homework submission for week 7 should include your summary and your lecture assignment for core lecture 13. Since it is pretty much midterm week, and I know that it's getting to be that part in the semester, don't worry about a mini lecture this week. Focus on core lecture 13. Start really familiarizing yourself with what's a scholarly source, what's a popular source, how you can distinguish the difference. It's going to help as you finalize Project 2, and it's going to really help once we hit Projects 3 and 4, again, where we are working with scholarly sources almost exclusively. All right, folks, so that is what I have for you on scholarly and popular sources. If you have any questions or would like to chat about anything in greater detail, please feel free to contact me via Canvas DM. Okay, everyone, until next time.